Welcome. In this video, we're going to talk about grounding. This is the first video of a bunch, right? So potentially like 7 or 11, depending on how I'm kind of counting it. Ideas I want you to consider as you're going through, again, your training. It could be in swordsmanship, it could be in open hand, it could really be in many physical things. So the premise of this is I want to give you a theme and a body location for you to kind of work your way up, kind of like troubleshooting, again, like your stances, how your swordsmanship is doing, all of that fun stuff. So the first idea I want to play with is the idea of grounding or rooting. So this is particularly fun because there's a way you can think about like the way most people think about grounding and rooting in terms of like stances. So for example, like if I am rooted to the spot, I can't move, right? Now, you can do that in some martial arts, or there's some aspects of martial arts. So when you're doing meditations, for example, and like you're in your sitting stance, you're doing your little meditation, being rooted to the spot's not a bad idea. So playing with that idea first very, very quickly and going into what I actually mean. So benefits of being rooted to these spots, right, are going to be if I am solid here, right? So if my feet are not moving at all, I can focus then on where my knees are, where my hips are, where's my solar plexus, where what everything is doing. So when we're in our standard sitting stance, how that feels different from our back stance versus our short stance versus our long stance. So all these things, if you're rooted, you can kind of feel how those muscle groups are activating with regard to each other, so relative to each other. Very, very useful. And as you do more of this, again, you're more rooted, you can also feel which muscle groups are being hyperactive. So for example, if my calves are very, very active when I could be maybe using my glute a little bit more, that is a good way to use, again, rooted to the spot. However, I like moving, right? So I like the ability to move. I like to be able to, strike from positions and all that fun stuff. So when I talk about rooting, I actually want to kind of take that usual metaphor and flip it. So when we usually talk about rootedness, right? So let's just have a standard walking or flow stance, right? Not flow stance, natural stance, right? So the usual idea is kind of like if you paint a word picture, you're putting down roots through your feet. It could be, again, like the soles, it could be the balls of the feet, it could be the heel, whatever's going on, right? And that's kind of like rooting into the ground, and from there you kind of have a stability. I want to take that idea and reverse it. So I like the word rooted, so I'm going to keep using that. I'm going to use a slightly different verbiage in a little bit. So I want you to think about, instead of going down, feeling your feet going up, right? So I want you to think about stability kind of crawling up your body this way. So if you have a weak joint, or if you have like a weird bend, I want you to feel when the roots kind of like hit a snag, right? So for example, if I give you something really, really wonky, I'm going to give you the worst stance I can think of, right? Hopefully this won't insult anyone. So I'm going to do something like this, right? This might be great for like, when you're on Broadway, for example, but if I'm fighting someone, this is not great. So what I'm going to do is, okay, from the ground up, I want to think about like, okay, well, this, so my heel, that doesn't feel great, especially considering how close I am, my 2 feet are to one another. Okay, so in order to feel more stable, I would like to have maybe a little bit more surface area grounded. And as I'm kind of relieving this weird bend, again, feel those roots. I'm going to switch verbiage to almost like vines, again, like vines crawling up. Feel where that structure can be a little bit more stable. Okay, so by unbending that knee, and again, now activating more of my glute, for example, this is suddenly a lot more stable. So you can kind of go up the whole body that way, right? So if initially it was this, I'm activating more of my glute, which is going to kick that heel down. The first major part, so kind of like the part of your body I want you to focus on when you're thinking about grounding is going to be the tailbone. So with this weird thing, my tailbone is kind of like pointed and pointing in a weird direction in a weird location relative to my hips. So what I want to do is, as I'm activating this, I want to bring that tailbone underneath my body a little bit more. Awesome. So with regard to that tailbone, I want you to primarily focus on, at least in this first, again, rooting situation, I want you to feel the roots coming up from the ground and kind of like clawing into either side of your hip. So I kind of, again, have that very strong idea. So from here, if I kind of like get my tailbone where it's supposed to be, even if I do something weird like this, the bottom half of my body is fine. So from there, just taking the same theme going up. So the next major kind of node I would be thinking about, like in this particular case, would probably be my solar plexus, where my center of balance sort of is. I'm going to tuck that more over my hip. I'm also going to kind of maybe fix my neck. And then all that's left is my arms, right? And that's going to be more related to what my sword would be doing, or if it's a fighting guard or something like that. So that's the general idea. I want you to think about, instead of roots going down, roots coming up into your hips. And because this is a sword channel, I want to relate that a little bit more to our swordsmanship, right? So for the anatomy of the sword, I'm going to say the tailbone is pretty much where the bottom of the sword is, where your left hand is gripping is going to be, right? So if I wanted to have a very stable, very strong rootedness for my body here, once again, so normally when you think about holding a sword, my hand is kind of like vining up this way, so I can be very aware of the tip, even though my left hand is the one kind of moving, all that fun stuff. I want this to be both directions. So I want you to think about almost again like roots or vines coming from the very bottom of the sword, crawling up your arm into your socket, right, into your shoulder socket. So if I have a lot of weird bends in my arms like this, for example, noticing this guy, this guy, this guy, even this weird kind of angle here, this is not a stable fighting card, right? Versus if I, again, feel coming from the bottom, snaking its way up, this is my first weak point, I'm going to fix it. A little bit more that way. Okay? This is still a little weird. I'm going to probably just do a little bit of this guy. Now, it really depends on where the tip is going to be, but the same theory is going to be going through, right? So this bend is not giving me a lot of power or stability. So by either moving the bend so it's underneath, so it's kind of more natural where the flow of the body usually is, that's good. Now, can you do this, ready to like thrust? Absolutely, right? But it's all about trying to figure out like where that stability is and where you can get, again, a good structure for you to be doing stuff with. So general rule of thumb is, again, feel it out, feel where like the first weak joint is, and try to do something about that, right? So especially when we start adding like kinetics to this, so we actually start moving things, the first weak joint is where things are going to fall apart. So if I strike a target like this, for example, this is going to break, so to speak, and my sword is going to go flying, right? So I want to have everything as stable as it can be, and if there is a weak joint, I want it to be much further down the line as opposed to very early. Again, these joints are getting progressively stronger, right? Wrist, elbow, shoulder, sternum. Sternum's not a joint, right? But you get the idea. The more radially, right? So the farther away it is from your body or the core in general, the weaker it's going to be. So as you're thinking about rooting it back into, again, like the heart of your body, think about where it's weak. But take that idea everywhere. So I want you to think about where your tailbone is relative to your hips, to your knees, to your heels, pretty much to everywhere. Again, relative to your solar plexus. So the main point of rootedness and grounding is for you to have a strong structure with which to do stuff, right? So it's a little bit easier to see like longer stances. If my tailbone's like out there, I'm kind of like doing this stance, not great. Versus if it's a little bit more underneath my body, even if it's like pivoting this way, it's still a lot more stable. Let's take that same idea and apply it to something that may apparently, like an appearance, contradict what I'm saying, but it's all going to be doing the same thing. So if we do like a hook, for example, in our kind of like our boxing kind of guard, notice I'm very stable here. There are bends, right? So this seems to contradict what I was talking about before, but my tailbone is still tucked correctly. It's not kind of like weird out here or up here. It's solidly under my body, under my solar plexus here, right? And just kind of like as a point of fact, just make sure as you're doing this, because this is actually also very well rooted, because again, the knee is still a hinge. It's not intended to really be like a ball and socket where you can kind of like twist it every which way. It's most stable when it's everything, so in your hip, your knee, and your heel are all on one single plane. So with that, it's gonna be a lot more stable, although look like it's contradicting, again, the whole like bendedness, because my tailbone is where it needs to be, at least my body structure is still pretty solid. So take the idea, right? I'm trying to keep these videos a little bit shorter than I usually do because goodness knows, even listening to myself editing it for like 30 minutes is not ideal. So what I'd like to do is, so as you're working your way up through the body, think about your tailbone. Think about how everything is rooting towards your tailbone and all that fun stuff. But with that, make sure you stay safe, stay humble, and keep training.